The offer that silenced the room. The ballroom of the Meridian Hotel glowed with polished marble, soft gold lighting, and the low murmur of people who had come dressed in their best intentions. It was a charity technology summit, the kind where sleek presentations promised brighter futures and donors smiled over crystal glasses. On the main stage, speakers took turns celebrating innovation, progress, and possibility. Everything moved smoothly, comfortably, almost predictably, until Victor Harlan stood. He didn't rise quickly. He let the applause build, slow and respectful, before lifting one hand to quiet it. Victor was a man who had learned how to command rooms without raising his voice. His suit was dark, tailored within an inch of its life. His expression was composed, unreadable. When he leaned into the microphone, the soft echo of the ballroom seemed to retreat. "I have something a little different planned," he said, his voice even, almost amused. "A challenge." An assistant stepped forward and placed a thick, sealed envelope on the podium. The paper looked old, important. Victor rested his palm on it, as if on a chess piece. "Inside this envelope is a legal document," he continued. "Not a simple one, not something you skim. It's dense, technical, and in my experience largely misunderstood." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I will pay $5 million to anyone in this room who can read it aloud and accurately explain what it says." The number rippled through the crowd like a dropped glass. People shifted, laughed softly. A few leaned forward in their seats. $5 million was not charity. It was spectacle. Victor's gaze moved slowly across the audience. Not guess, not summarize. Explain. Then, from the middle rows, a small hand rose. It belonged to a boy who looked no older than 12. He stood beside an elderly woman in a simple blue dress, her hands folded in her lap. The boy was slim, dark-haired, his posture careful, almost reserved. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply held his hand up. A scattered chuckle drifted through the ballroom. Someone near the back laughed openly. Victor tilted his head, studying him with visible interest. Then he smiled. "Of course," he said lightly. "Why not?" The assistant carried the envelope down the aisle. The room buzzed with curiosity, amusement, and something sharper beneath it. The boy accepted the document with both hands and stepped toward the stage, his grandmother watching him with a stillness that felt heavier than applause. No one expected the boy to even finish the first page, but the first sentence made the billionaire's smile falter. A boy they never saw. Elijah Carter's afternoons rarely looked like the ones people expected from a boy his age. While other children drifted home with earbuds in and eyes locked to glowing screens, Elijah walked the long way to the neighborhood library, guiding his grandmother's slow steps beside him. The library was small, tucked between a closed bakery and a nail salon, but to Elijah it felt endless. He helped his grandmother into the same window seat every time, set her knitting bag at her feet, and then disappeared into aisles most people skipped. He didn't reach first for comics or the bright covers near the front. He pulled down thick books with titles that sounded like courtrooms and history lectures, old land records, civil charters, case studies, pages that smelled faintly of dust and glue. He read quietly, steadily, not racing for endings but lingering over language. When he didn't understand a word, he wrote it on the back of an envelope and asked the librarian later. When he finished a chapter, he looked up, not to be praised, but to think. Sometimes his grandmother watched him over her glasses, a softness in her eyes that came from knowing how much he carried without complaint. Since his parents' deaths, Elijah had learned to listen before speaking, to observe before stepping forward. He learned which bus drivers waited, which store clerks rushed, which systems bent, and which broke. At home, their small apartment filled with second-hand furniture and evening light, Elijah read eviction notices as carefully as novels, scholarship pamphlets as closely as adventure stories. He wasn't studying for tests. He was studying the invisible hands that moved people's lives. While Victor Harlan raised cities of glass and steel, Elijah built something quieter. He built rooms inside himself where patience lived, where questions gathered, where words were tools instead of weapons. What Elijah carried to that stage wasn't confidence. It was dangerous to power. The document. On stage, the envelope looked heavier than paper should. Victor returned to the podium, framing the moment with a relaxed chuckle, as if this were an intermission trick rather than a serious test. "Let's have some fun," he said, though Maya, standing a few steps behind him, saw the small tightening at the corners of his eyes. She had organized his documents for years. She knew when something mattered. This did. The assistant placed the envelope in Elijah's hands. He didn't tear it. He slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it carefully, as if whatever lived inside could bruise. He unfolded the pages, one after another, until the contract hung between his palms like a narrow curtain. The paper was crowded with fine print and boxed clauses, the kind designed to exhaust attention before meaning ever arrived. Elijah inhaled, then began. His voice was soft at first, almost tentative, but clear. Each word landed without rush, without show. Conversations at the tables faded. The clink of silverware disappeared. He adjusted his grip and continued, his tone finding a steadier path, his cadence smoothing like water over stone. He didn't stumble. He didn't perform. He simply read on and on. The language was technical, but not empty. It spoke of parcels and percentages, of trusts layered within trusts, of ownership shifting quietly from one name to another. It spoke of obligations deferred, of conditions postponed, of futures that existed only on paper. Victor's expression remained composed, yet something restless moved beneath it. Maya watched his jaw tighten, watched his fingers curl against the podium's edge. Elijah turned the page. The room felt suspended between expectation and something unnamed that no one could quite place yet. Halfway through the first page, the audience stops hearing a boy and starts hearing a witness. When reading becomes reckoning. Elijah reached the bottom of the page, paused, and then did something Victor had not prepared for. He looked up, not at the crowd first, but at the words themselves, as if measuring them against something only he could see. Then he spoke again, and this time he did not read. "So this part," Elijah said gently, tapping the page with one finger, "says the land was placed into a trust so it could only be used for housing and education. It says the trust was supposed to receive funding every year. That money was meant to maintain the property and build on it." A murmur moved through the ballroom. Elijah glanced back down, scanning the next paragraph. But this section changes how the money moves. It reroutes it. It delays it. And this part makes it optional. He turned another page, slower now. Which means the trust can exist without ever being supported. He looked up again. His voice remained calm, but something in it deepened. So it wasn't protected. It was parked. People leaned forward in their seats. Phones lifted. Victor's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. His smile stayed in place, but it no longer reached his eyes. Elijah continued. He pointed out overlapping clauses that contradicted each other. Promises made in one section quietly undone 3 pages later. He translated complexity into clarity. Every sentence peeled something back. "And here," Elijah said, tracing a narrow column of text, "it mentions a community housing trust." He sounded almost surprised. "It says it was announced publicly. It says families were relocated. It says the trust would hold funds to develop new housing and learning centers." The room was very still now. "But there's no deposit recorded," Elijah went on. "Not here, not in the next year either. There's language about intent, and language about future arrangements, but there's no confirmation that any money ever went into it." He turned the page once more. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet. Victor shifted his weight. Maya's eyes had gone wide, fixed on the contract. Elijah lifted his head. Then Elijah asks a single innocent question that changes the temperature of the room. The question, billionaires. Hate Elijah held the pages still, the way someone holds a fragile thing when they are afraid it might tear. "Excuse me," he said softly, and the microphone carried the smallness of his voice into every corner of the room. If the trust was created and the funding was promised, where did the money go? For a moment, no one reacted. The question did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like something a child might ask in a classroom, earnest and open, expecting an answer. Victor gave a brief, amused exhale. "These kinds of documents," he said smoothly, "are complicated. Funds move, structures change. That's precisely why they're difficult to understand." A ripple of uncertain laughter passed through the audience, thinner than before. Victor lifted one hand as if to guide the moment back to safety. "The point of this challenge is comprehension, not—" Elijah looked back down. He turned another page. His voice returned, steady. He read a paragraph about municipal transfers. Then another. Then he paused again. "This part references a redevelopment project," he said. "It lists 3 neighborhoods. It says the residents were relocated temporarily. It says alternative housing would be provided during construction." A faint sound escaped his grandmother. Elijah did not look at her, but his shoulders shifted, as if he had felt it. He scanned further. "It says demolition was completed. It says the land was cleared." His brow creased slightly. "But there's no follow-up, no housing records, no completion dates, no evidence the redevelopment ever happened." Maya's hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from her face as she stared at the page Elijah was holding, as if she were seeing a ghost she had refused to name. In the 3rd row, Ruth Carter's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. The document was no longer about money. It was about people. A name from the past. Elijah turned another page, and the sound of paper was louder than it should have been. The print shifted here, thinner, interrupted. Near the bottom, the lines broke into something different. A narrow strip of handwriting, slanted and deliberate, had been added in dark ink. He leaned closer. "This is an addendum," Elijah said quietly. "It changes the beneficiary." He read the name. Ruth Carter. The syllables landed like a dropped glass. Chairs creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. On the 2nd row, the elderly woman beside the empty seat did not move. She simply closed her eyes. Elijah's head lifted. He looked at her then, confusion flickering across his face. He hadn't known. The document trembled once between his fingers. "This says," he continued slower now, "that the original land donation was made by Thomas Carter. It says the land was gifted to be used for a community education center. It says the trust was formed to protect that purpose." His grandmother's hands had gone rigid on the armrests. "It says the center would offer after-school programs, literacy services, and job training." He swallowed. "It says construction would begin within 2 years of the donation." He turned the page. "There's no construction record attached, no permits, no expenditures, no follow-up reports." He looked up again, not to the audience this time, but to Ruth. "It doesn't say why." Ruth opened her eyes. They shone, but she did not cry. Victor had gone very still. The contract no longer looked like a challenge. It looked like a trail. The boy stood between 2 histories he had not meant to touch, holding a truth that did not belong only to him. The challenge had turned into testimony, and Victor was suddenly the one on stage. For a moment, no one remembered to breathe again. The man who couldn't interrupt. Victor stepped forward, his shoes clicking once against the stage, a sound too sharp in the quiet. "All right," he said, lifting his hand, the practiced gesture of a man used to ending conversations. "This has gone far enough. The document is being misread. Context matters. These are internal drafts, not conclusions." His voice was calm, but it no longer carried ease. Elijah did not argue. He simply looked back down at the pages. Victor spoke again, quicker this time. "Legal structures evolve. You can't isolate sentences and pretend you understand the whole. A few people shifted in their seats. No one laughed. Elijah turned one more page. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Whatever he meant to say seemed to arrive too late. The more he tried to explain, the more he sounded like someone circling a locked door without the key. The audience was no longer watching a billionaire host a challenge. They were watching a man try to interrupt a record. Elijah continued reading quietly, and the calmness of it stripped something away. There was no drama in his tone, no triumph, only steady disclosure. With every paragraph, the layers of technical language began to feel thinner, less impressive, less protective. People began to see what he saw, not brilliance but design, not genius but distance. Complexity used not to solve problems, but to bury them. Behind Victor, Maya had lowered her eyes to the tablet in her hands. Her fingers moved once, then again. Her breathing changed. She pulled up archived files she had stored years ago and never revisited, press releases, redevelopment proposals, internal summaries. Her screen filled with dates and logos and scanned signatures. She compared them to the lines Elijah was reading. They matched. Maya's jaw tightened. She took one step closer to the podium, then stopped. Her thumb hovered over the display icon, uncertain, as if waiting for permission she knew she would not receive. Victor followed her movement with his eyes, and then the screen behind them lights up. The midpoint reveal. Without announcing it, Maya lifted the tablet and touched the screen. The projector caught instantly, flooding the wall behind the stage with light. A familiar logo appeared, then an older video frame, slightly grainy. Victor's younger face filled the space, standing at a podium years earlier, smiling broadly beneath a banner that read, "Renewal Initiative." A murmur rolled through the ballroom. The video played. Victor's recorded voice rang out, confident, generous. He spoke of restoring neighborhoods, of replacing boarded windows with classrooms, of building housing that would not push families away, but gather them back. He promised literacy centers, job training, safe spaces for children after school. Applause thundered from the past, echoing faintly into the present. Elijah stood motionless, the document still open in his hands. He glanced up once, then back down. When the video faded to a freeze frame of Victor shaking hands with city officials, Elijah spoke again. "This is the project described here," he said, "the one connected to the trust." He read a clause aloud. It described delays. It described restructuring. It described funds being rerouted through secondary entities. He lifted his eyes. "This version removes the obligation to build anything." Maya swiped. The screen split. On one side, Victor's promise. On the other, scanned pages from Elijah's document, dense and quiet, filled with technical language and missing destinations. What had been celebration was now comparison. People leaned forward, not to admire, but to reconcile. They saw the bright words they had once believed beside the narrow sentences that had replaced them. The applause from the video felt wrong now, like a sound from another life. Victor's hands slid from the podium. No one spoke. No one needed to. The contrast stood on its own. What had been promised and what had been done. The room realizes this was never a reading challenge. It was a cover, the darkest moment. The screen went black. Victor moved before anyone else could. He reached behind the podium, and with a sharp press of a button, the image vanished. The sudden darkness unsettled the room. The host at the side of the stage looked from Victor to the audience, his smile faltering, hands fluttering, as if searching for instructions that weren't there. Two men in dark suits stepped forward from the edge of the room. Security. They didn't touch Elijah, but their presence bent the air. One of them spoke quietly to the host, who nodded too quickly and leaned toward the microphone. Let's pause for a moment," he said. "Young man, perhaps you should return to your seat." A murmur rippled outward. Elijah stood where he was, the document still open in his hands. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused anyone. And yet the tone of the room had shifted, as if something fragile had been dropped. Victor cleared his throat. "This has become inappropriate," he said. "We were here for charity, not confusion." The security men stepped closer. The space between Elijah and the podium narrowed. For a breath, it felt as if the old pattern would complete itself. The truth folded neatly away. Then a chair moved. Ruth Carter stood. She simply rose, one hand on the armrest, the other steadying herself as she faced the stage. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "My husband believed in that center," she said. "He believed children deserved a place where they weren't hurried past." The room stilled around her. "He signed those papers because he trusted what was said," she continued. "He trusted that words still meant something." Victor turned toward her. Ruth's gaze held him. There was no fury in it, only a tired kind of clarity. "I watched families pack their lives into boxes," she said. "I watched lots sit empty, and I kept waiting for the place that was promised." She paused, breathing once. "And tonight," she said softly, "I heard it disappear." What she says next fractures something in Victor that money never touched. The breaking point. Ruth did not raise her voice. She did not point. She spoke the way people speak when they are no longer trying to win. "My husband used to come home with chalk on his hands," she said. "He wasn't a rich man. He taught nights. He believed if you gave children a room and a light, they would build the rest themselves." She looked past the stage lights, as if seeing a classroom that only existed for her. "He believed education was not charity. He believed it was responsibility." The room listened. When the letters came, telling families to leave, he told them to be patient. He said the center would rise. He said the noise and dust would turn into doors and windows. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. He died before he saw either. Ruth's hand tightened around the edge of her chair. "After he was gone, I watched people scatter. I watched neighbors I'd known for 20 years move wherever they could. And I watched that lot sit empty." She turned her head slightly toward Elijah. "This boy," she said, "was 7 when he learned what an eviction notice was. He read them out loud to me because my eyes were tired. He learned to sound out words like relocation and temporary before he learned long division." A breath passed through the room. Ruth faced Victor again. "So when he reads a document, he isn't playing a game. He is listening for the place people fall through." Victor's shoulders had lowered. The careful alignment of his suit no longer disguised the weight he carried. He did not look angry. He did not look powerful. For the first time, he looked tired. Then Elijah hands the document back to Victor, his arms steady, his face calm. The only payment that mattered. The only payment that mattered. Elijah took the document from where it rested against Victor's palm and then gently placed it back there, as if returning something borrowed rather than exposing something hidden. "I don't want the money," he said. His voice was steady, not small, not loud, just clear. A faint stir moved through the crowd. Victor's eyes lifted, uncertain. Elijah went on. $5 million is a lot, but it's not what this paper is about." He turned slightly, glancing once at his grandmother, then back to the stage lights. "This talks about a building, about classrooms, about a place where kids were supposed to go after school instead of going home to empty rooms." He swallowed, but his voice did not break. "I want that place," he said. "The one that was promised. I want the center, the library, the rooms where people can learn and not be afraid of the next letter that comes in the mail." Someone near the front began recording, then another, then another. Red lights bloomed across the room. Elijah did not look at the cameras. "I don't need to be paid," he said quietly. "I just don't want the truth packed away again." Silence stretched, long enough to feel deliberate. Long enough that every person there understood they were watching a decision, not a moment. Victor stood with the document resting against his chest, his fingers no longer tight around it, but not loose either. The familiar confidence that usually carried him through interviews and earnings calls did not come. The practiced language did not arrive. The host did not speak. Security did not move. Victor's gaze drifted across the room, over the expectant faces, the lifted phones, the woman standing with her hands folded, the boy waiting without demand. For the first time that night, there was nothing to interrupt, and Victor finally speaks without rehearsing. Elijah took the document from where it rested against Victor S. palm and then gently placed it back there, as if returning something borrowed rather than exposing something hidden. "I don't want the money," he said. His voice was steady, not small, not loud, just clear. A faint stir moved through the crowd. Victor's eyes lifted, uncertain. Elijah went on. $5 million is a lot, but it's not what this paper is about. He turned slightly, glancing once at his grandmother, then back to the stage lights. This talks about a building, about classrooms, about a place where kids were supposed to go after school instead of going home to empty rooms. He swallowed, but his voice did not break. "I want that place," he said, "the one that was promised. I want the center, the library, the rooms where people can learn and not be afraid of the next letter that comes in the mail." Someone near the front began recording, then another, then another. Red lights bloomed across the room. Elijah did not look at the cameras. "I don't need to be paid," he said quietly. "I just don't want the truth packed away again." Silence stretched, long enough to feel deliberate. Long enough that every person there understood they were watching a decision, not a moment. Victor stood with the document resting against his chest, his fingers no longer tight around it, but not loose either. The familiar confidence that usually carried him through interviews and earnings calls did not come. The practiced language did not arrive. The host did not speak. Security did not move. Victor's gaze drifted across the room, over the expectant faces, the lifted phones, the woman standing with her hands folded, the boy waiting without demand. For the first time that night, there was nothing to interrupt. And Victor finally speaks without rehearsing. Where power kneels, Victor drew in a slow breath. It did not steady him. It simply marked the moment before he stopped trying to be steady at all. "The trust was never funded," he said. The words did not echo. They dropped. A collective exhale moved through the ballroom. Not relief, not shock, but recognition. Victor looked down once at the document in his hands, then back up. His voice was lower now, unprotected. "The announcements were made," he continued. "The project was publicized, but the funds were redirected, deferred, absorbed into other structures." His mouth tightened. "The center was never built." He paused, longer this time. "That was my decision." No justification followed, no explanation. Just the truth standing where excuses usually lived. "I can't repair what was taken," he said, "but I can stop pretending it was never owed." He turned slightly, addressing not the crowd, but the space where the screen had been. "Effective immediately, the trust will be funded in full, not through subsidiary channels, not through future commitments, directly." Maya lifted her head. Her hands had gone still. "The original purpose will be restored," Victor went on. "A community education center, housing support services, after-school programs, independent oversight." He looked at Maya. "All records opened, all development managed outside my private entities." He swallowed. "The $5 million offered tonight will become the seed funding." A murmur surged, then stilled again as Victor raised one hand. "This will not be a donation with my name on the front," he said. "It will not be a monument. It will be a correction." The word hung there, heavier than applause. Victor's shoulders lowered another inch, as if something had finally been set down. "For the families who were moved," he said. "For the land that was given. For the place that should have existed." No one clapped. They watched. Victor stepped back from the podium. He did not smile. But the most powerful moment doesn't involve money at all. The quiet. After the applause. Weeks later, the lot no longer slept behind rusted chain and weeds. The fences were gone. In their place stood pale gravel paths, temporary classrooms stitched from clean white panels, windows open to winter light. The air smelled of cut wood and dust, not abandonment. Children filled the space cautiously at first, as if afraid the ground might remember its silence. Then laughter found its way in. Folding tables held donated books. Teachers wrote schedules on boards that still shone. Volunteers carried boxes. Someone painted a mural of open doors. Elijah came most afternoons after school. He did not rush. He helped unload crates, sorted spines by size, by subject, by the way they felt in his hands. When a younger boy asked where to put biographies, Elijah knelt and showed him how stories could live together. Ruth sat near the entrance on a borrowed chair, watching children cross a place that once only promised them. Sometimes she spoke to parents. Sometimes she just held her grandson's jacket across her knees and listened. One afternoon, a man stepped through the open gate alone. Victor Harlan wore a simple coat. No one announced him. He stood for a moment, unsure of his place. Then he approached a table where children were reading aloud in uneven voices. He did not interrupt. He listened quietly, for once. A girl stumbled over a word. Elijah leaned down and whispered it. The girl smiled and continued. Victor watched from a few steps back, his hands empty, his posture unguarded. When he finally spoke, it was to ask where to place a box he had carried in himself. Elijah pointed to an empty shelf. Victor set the books down carefully, as if they might bruise. And Elijah realizes something even bigger was built than a building. What $5 million couldn't buy. By the time the permanent walls began to rise, people had stopped calling it Victor's project. They called it the center, the place on the corner, the new rooms. Ownership had softened into something shared. On the morning the first finished classroom opened, Elijah arrived early with his grandmother. Sunlight spilled through wide windows onto shelves that still smelled faintly of fresh wood. The floor was clean. The air was quiet in the way quiet feels before something good begins. Ruth settled into a chair near the door, her hands folded around her bag. She watched Elijah move slowly along the shelves, touching spines, straightening stacks, as if greeting old friends. There were no cameras, no speeches, only the low hum of people arriving, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of pages being opened for the first time. Victor did not stand at the front. He stayed near the back, speaking softly with a teacher, asking where supplies were kept, listening more than he talked. When a volunteer thanked him, he only nodded and returned to arranging books someone else had donated. Elijah reached the final shelf. At its center sat a single thin book, its cover still uncreased. He lifted it carefully, feeling the small weight of it, the simple promise inside. He walked to an empty desk near the window and sat. Outside, a group of children gathered, uncertain, peering through the glass as if waiting for permission. Elijah opened the book and began to read quietly, the words finding their place in the room. A girl pushed the door open, then another. Soon chairs filled. No one announced the moment. It happened the way real things do. A boy once expected to stumble had changed the direction of a man who thought he had already won. Not with money, not with noise, but with attention, with patience, with the courage to say what he saw. Because sometimes the document isn't what changes everything. It's who has the courage to read it.